Friends of the Gambia, ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to address the issue of female circumcision or cutting in other terms it has also been called female genital mutilation as a human rights issue. But before I do, I wish to thank the organizers of the Gambian Cultural Week in Oslo, Norway, for their very kind invitation and the hospitality that they have demonstrated since our arrival. I am really extremely delighted and honored to be here, as this is an opportunity that I appreciate greatly and one that I will always cherish. Paul and I, as my wife, also wish to thank our hosts, Omar Rame and Ivo Rame, and all our friends, old and new, for their warm reception and hospitality since our arrival in this lovely city. We are indeed greatly touched. Now, in reflecting upon the issues of female genital mutilation or female circumcision, what I will try to do is to provide an overview of some of the issues I consider to be important. Invariably, many of the things talked about by Amy, I will also talk about. There is indeed a lot of overlap between these concerns that I raised. And hopefully, during the question and answer period, I will be able to flesh out some of the concerns and questions that you may have. Let me begin by suggesting or saying that by setting aside this week to celebrate the Gambia's rich and diverse cultural heritage, Gambians in Oslo, and in particular all of Norway, help maintain and sustain, and in fact renew, the ties that bind Gambians in the diaspora to this tiny but beautiful country and its peoples. In celebrating the Gambia and its people, you recognize and in fact highlight the place and contribution of the Gambia to a world of interrelated cultures. In setting aside this week to celebrate the Gambia, Gambians in Norway also showcase to the larger community of Oslo the Gambia in all its beauty, its majesty, and yes, of course, its contradictions. And contrary to the presumption that globalization has the inevitable effect of neutralizing many non-Western cultures, this Cultural Week in Oslo reaffirms the historic resilience and changing nature of Senegambian culture, and Gambian culture in particular, despite the influences from other cultures. This enduring yet changing nature of Senegambian and Gambian culture in particular has to do in part with the Gambia's geographic location. Gambia's cultural location, which is at the confluence of three major cultural civilizations: African, Arab, Islamic, and European. These civilizations have together shaped and continue to shape Gambian culture. Thus, Gambian culture is in many ways a syncretic culture. It is a culture that has been influenced, but more importantly, the African and Islamic strands perhaps are most dominant. Nonetheless, we must not underestimate the influence of Western and Christian cultures. Their effects are lasting and are still being felt today as they manifest themselves, likewise influenced by others. The issue of female discussion or cutting, as talked about by Amy, is a very sensitive one and a concern that is not customarily discussed by Gambian males and male academics at that. Many have tended to ignore the issue and or have stood by the sideline and yielded to Gambian female activists, Western and African female academics, non-governmental organizations, and so forth and so on. Low male, and in particular Gambian male participation in this debate could be explained by the exclusivity that Gambian women have had over this issue. I must say, though, that this is changing gradually, and that while female exclusivity in framing the issues and the practice of FGM is still present, some men have joined the debate for a change. Thus, the cultural constraints that once limited discussion of female circumcision to female initiates alone, and who in turn gather their secrets from men and foreigners, are now eroding, perhaps very slowly. Now, discussing the issue of female excision or female genital mutilation as a male has its limits, obviously. And I therefore ask you to indulge with me in a discourse that is intended more to explore and raise some important concerns rather than to offending cultural sensibilities, and those of initiates in particular. Now, what takes place in women's secret societies, however, during female circumcision is paradoxically an open secret, thanks to the works of African, Gambian women activists, organizations, Western female academics, and activists as well. Thus, I could share with you that my venture in this terrain of female circumcision is a consequence of training, teaching, and interest in various aspects of international development, political economy, women, gender issues, and feminist theory for well over a decade. This interest was, in fact, very academic at the beginning. It took seeing the Malayan film, Fanshen, the docudrama Warrior Marks by Alice Walker, about 10 and 5 years ago respectively, and listening to the harrowing narrative of a young Gambian woman initiated in London about 2 years ago, to really awaken me and end my days at the sidelines. In fact, Warrior Marks and the Gambian woman's narrative in particular left me sleepless for several nights and forced me to look at female genital mutilation critically since. It is not necessarily, I would say, the foci or the foci of my academic research, yet it has nonetheless taken a significant chunk of my research time and interest in the last 2 years. This in part because of the promise that I made to the Gambian woman initiate I met many few years ago. Unlike other cultures, Gambians continue to evolve new institutions to help adaptation to ever-changing domestic needs and international concerns. It is my view that female genital mutilation is a maladaptive practice, a practice that must do away with the most painful and dangerous attributes should we wish to keep the rituals and the celebrations. The elements that emphasize respect for elders, instill hard work and responsibility among initiates, the ceremonies and the celebration marking the rite of passage from childhood to womanhood, personhood, etc., are elements that are worth preserving without the physical cutting of genital parts. When it comes to eradication, I believe that education, discussion, medicalization as practiced in some countries as a transition to eradication, or eradication as argued from a human rights perspective, legislation, and all other strategies have an important part to play. We may not all agree on a given mode, but together we can make an impact. For instance, a mother or group of mothers who refuse to circumcise their daughters would be contributing in no small measure to the ultimate eradication of female circumcision. Likewise, as Ami has hinted earlier, fathers, brothers, uncles, and all the male relatives who convince their wives and daughters not to engage in circumcision, or support their partners and daughters who refuse to do so, could also have a major impact. But perhaps the most all of us can do is to be educated and educate others about the issues pertaining to female circumcision. Despite the ranging controversy surrounding the practice, many people, unfortunately, remain uninformed. It is our duty, therefore, to then educate ourselves and help others acquire information about the subject and the issues. When it comes to female cutting and its eradication, I am on the side of the debate that argues that despite our cultural differences, binding universal laws, standards, and norms are possible. In fact, I feel that they are necessary. This is because, despite our cultural differences, many principles and covenants in international law are premised on different and sometimes divergent customs. The international community is generally agreed that torture, genocide, slavery, and rape of women, political prisoners, are crimes against humanity. Consequently, we must not hide behind the edifice of culture, cultural explanations, and excuses to justify female circumcision. In fact, few people do that. As the Burmese political activist Aung San Suu Kyi argues so eloquently, the National Culture Eye Code can become a bizarre draft of carefully selected historical incidents and distorted social values intended to justify the politics and actions of those in power. She goes on to add that as for the charge of cultural imperialism, I quote again, when democracy and human rights are said to run counter to non-Western cultures, such cultures are oftentimes defined narrowly and presented as if they were a monolith. To avoid this, she contends that it is possible to conceive of rights which place human worth above power and liberation above control. Female circumcision, again, in my view, is the imposition of control over women in societies that are inherently patriarchal, even when women control and many support the practice. Men who support it do so in order to preserve gender elements of a culture that are no longer defensible, so as to preserve male power, privilege, and advantage. It has little or nothing to do with religion, chastity, or tradition, but has everything to do with power. Female circumcision straddles both health and human rights issues, and as such needs a community-based, multi-dimensional approach to eradicate it. I urge you all, therefore, to get engaged and engage others in the debates and efforts to end female circumcision in the Gambia and elsewhere. This week's celebration of Gambian culture in Oslo is a reaffirmation that our culture, despite its shortcomings, is rich and one that all of us must take pride in. That you, together with women and men all over, including your Norwegian hosts and hostesses, governments and governmental organizations, will commit yourselves to the struggle to bring about a day when young girls will not be circumcised. That we will all work together toward a day when women will become equal partners and citizens of the world. Because men will never be completely and truly free unless the rights and freedoms, advantages and privileges that they have and take for granted are shared equally by women. Those Gambians, including Ami and many others, who risk life and limb and are leaders in the struggle, need our moral support. But more important, they also need our financial support. Too much is at risk when we leave the issues of female genital mutilation to a few politicians in the Gambia. In other words, we must support the fight for gender equality in the Gambia and elsewhere. And in fighting for gender equality and human rights, we must also fight for freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and not the least of all, free and fair elections in the Gambia come 2001. Because our chances of achieving gender equality is most optimal under a democracy rather than the military dictatorship that is currently in place in the Gambia. In conclusion, by setting this week aside to celebrate the Gambia's rich cultural diversity and history, Gambians in Oslo and in Norway demonstrate beyond doubt the proud traditions and practices we cherish as a people, and show to the world that the Gambia and Africa occupy a central place in the diverse cultures of humankind. That our cultures are indeed dynamic, rich, and innovative, and want to be emulated by the world for its humanistic and other attributes. However, a culture that does not re-evaluate its deeply held values and traditions periodically and then discard its most undesirable elements would most certainly flounder in the end. We commend the Gambian and Muslim communities in Oslo and throughout Norway, their Norwegian friends, neighbors, governmental and non-governmental organizations, and implore them to work together in educating each other about female circumcision and its eradication. Thank you very much.